Have you ever experienced the profound yet often unspoken journey of anticipatory grief, the emotional roller coaster that caregivers go through even before the loss occurs? Today, we're honored to have with us Dr. Julie Norstrand, a beacon of knowledge and experience in aging, mental health, and caregiving. Dr. Norstrand, with her rich educational background in social work, clinical psychology, and a Ph.D., focusing on age-friendly communities, brings a unique perspective on these crucial topics. Dr. Norstrand's journey in the field of aging spans over 15 years. Her work encompasses a wide range of roles, from serving on boards with age-related missions, setting up peer-led support groups for caregivers and older adults, teaching courses that shed light on the aging experience, and the understanding of the physical, emotional, and cognitive changes that occur as we age have informed her comprehensive research and hands-on involvement in the various aspects of this field. Currently, she is the owner of Help My Aging Parents. She consults with families in the early stages of caregiving, aimed at fostering proactive planning and initiating those vital conversations around this topic. Today, she shares her insights around caregiving and anticipatory grief, distinguishing those complex emotions, the importance of effective communication, the impact of community on quality of life for older adults, and the key role of a caregiver supporting aging in place. We look at the power of trust and the invaluable support of caregiver groups. Here is my interview with Dr. Julie Norstrand. Julie, thank you for being here. We met, gosh, how many months ago, but now we finally get to speak face to face. I'm so glad the time has come.
So am I. Thank you, Nicole, so much for inviting me.
You are welcome. Well, I would love for you to share with us before we get started more about you, your background, how you got into this caregiver space so our audience can have an understanding of what brought you here and a little bit of your expertise.
Sure. So my background is social work. When I first came to America way back in 95, my thinking was that I was going to go into more the mental health arena. I actually got an internship working with people with major mental health disorders. But very early on, already by 98, I started becoming extremely interested in older adults. And sort of fast forward maybe about 10 or 15 years after then, I ended up getting my PhD in social work. And my dissertation looked at this concept called social capital, which is really trying to get an understanding of how the community impacts the individual, both in their physical and emotional well-being. And I really focused in on older adults. And over time, I've come to realize that one of the key components in trying to make sure that the older person can stay age in place for as long as possible is to really make sure that you have a reliable caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
Often that's family, but it can certainly also be a paid caregiver. So about 7, 8 years ago, I started up my company called Help My Aging Parents. And the goal with that has really been to try and get people to wake up, meaning that the family should really be much more ready proactively, planning ahead, knowing what's out there in terms of what kind of resources are available, what services are available for the older adults, often their parents, as well as for the caregiver. So that's the sort of the crux of where I'm at now in terms of really trying to help families, help them navigate through this very tricky period in their lives.
It's such a tricky period. And when you and I had spoke before, we talked about, we plan for all of these things. We plan for retirement. We plan,
Mm.
even when we're younger and have kids, we're planning for their future. Why are we not planning for caregiving? Right?
And that's such a great question. And it's sort of the question that I'm always asking myself, because when I meet people who generally are more in the thick of things and really scrambling, really sort of in dire straits, all of them, I've never found someone who said, oh, the planning process, I didn't need to do that. They have all said to me, I wish I had planned more. I wished I'd asked the questions such as, do you have a healthcare proxy?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where you want to live or continue living? You know, all these very basic questions. And I think one of the challenges for the adult child and also for the older parent, let's say, is that talking about caregiving, end of life, goes towards death.
Yeah.
And we just don't want to talk about that.
Right. It's uncomfortable. Yeah.
It's very uncomfortable. The unfortunate thing is, if you're not prepared, if you don't have a plan in place, that whole process becomes so much more stressful.
Yeah, it does.
And unfortunately, the end result for all of us will be our eventual death. And why not try to make it so that it's something that is as well planned and meets the needs of the individual person as much as possible. My motto is always, if you don't start talking about it, how can you start planning for it?
Yeah. If we don't know, we don't know, right? We don't
Exactly.
know.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes. You had said something too where it's one of those things that you just spoke to, but a lot of my former guests have said that overarching theme is plan ahead, plan ahead, plan ahead. In every,
Yep.
in every aspect, it's so important. It really is.
And you know, it's interesting. I've done some surveys with caregivers, and at the end of the survey, the question I've asked is, what recommendation do you have for people who haven't really entered the caregiving space yet, but they know that they will need to? And every single one of these people on these surveys always say, my recommendation is to get people to start planning.
Yes.
So clearly they've all been through it. They've all realized that the benefits of planning ahead, knowing what to do and, you know, the resources and services, as I mentioned just a moment ago.
Yeah. And that's the best advice from people that have walked through it before, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, you know, just on a side, but one of the things that I found very interesting about that survey is that people have said, the ones who are caregivers have said that the people that they wish to talk to the most in terms of getting information, getting support, is often other caregivers.
Right.
And just as you were saying, you know, it's because these people have walked in their shoes. They really understand the challenges that many caregivers face.
Completely. And for our conversation today, we're kind of looking at a couple different things because I think they tie together. Looking at that caregiver and anticipatory grief, how does the community impact our quality of life for older adults and that caregiver support aging in place? And when you had mentioned about, we don't want to maybe think about all the things because when we do, we're looking at that later in life, which then that last step of that is passing away, is death. And so we are having so many emotions around that, and as caregiving, it's so emotional. There's a lot of different challenges that can lead to us pre-grieving what maybe is to come. How have your personal experience or insights with caregivers, how do we start to digest and cope with some of these complex emotions?
So in actual fact, I'm running caregiver support groups at the moment. And one of them, I have several members, both men and women, who either have a spouse or who have a parent who has some form of dementia. And anticipatory grief is certainly something that has come up very strongly.
Yeah.
And one example I'm thinking of is an older man, 85 years old, taking care of his wife. And it's very clear for him that she was diagnosed back in, I believe it was 2018, and is now really just the shell of herself. And for him, it's been heart-wrenching because it's that long goodbye.
Yeah.
And, with every stage that he's gone through, he's been having to sort of let go over time. And So he's a classic example of that anticipatory grief.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, the way he has dealt with it is by really being very honest with himself in terms of what's going on, acknowledging that it's out of his control, there is just nothing he can do, and making sure that he's starting a life for himself. And I think that's been quite a healthy approach in that he has made sure that he's able to get his resources, his energy, any kind of positive input from other people and his hobbies. This gentleman that I'm thinking of, he loves jazz music, and he will, as much as time allows, he will go out and play with his jazz band. And that's one of his coping mechanisms. He also has family that he certainly relies on. And that's one of the things that I found is not only do these support groups help people with the anticipatory grief. For example, the Alzheimer's Association has some wonderful caregiver support groups. Furthermore, beyond that, what I've also found is that people, if they can find a family member that they can really have as a support mechanism, that can be very helpful. Taking care of themselves, right? Not only in terms of emotional support, but it's also physically trying to make sure that they get the exercise, proper food, sleep, rest, and being good to themselves. One of the challenges I often hear with caregivers is that sense of guilt that they're not doing enough. And my answer to that is always to be kind to yourself. And we actually had just a very interesting conversation yesterday in one of my support groups. And one of the things I was saying to them was, at this point in time, you may feel that you're really grappling with your situation. But as long as you feel that at the end of the day, you've done as much as you could, then hopefully that will make you feel better about your situation. But that's easier said than done. I fully acknowledge that. But again, it comes from giving that message, and for many caregivers in these support groups, giving that message to each other. And I think people need to hear that, because if they don't hear it from the outside, just telling it to themselves may not be enough. So, I mean, one thing that I always try and ensure is that people who know a caregiver, even if they themselves are not a caregiver, give them support. They need it. And show your appreciation for what they're doing. Sorry, I probably went way over.
No, it was wonderful because you actually answered some of my questions within that, which is perfect. And it's such good advice and good reminders to do that. How do we distinguish between maybe the anticipatory grief that we feel, but then there's other emotions that go along with caregiving in our role? Or does it all live together?
It lives together, but I think with the anticipatory grief, the challenge with it is that it's so often so slow. It's, as I mentioned just a moment ago, it's that long goodbye. And that you feel that your life is on hold. And that is difficult for anyone, because as many of the caregivers I speak to will say, I didn't choose this. This is not a role that I asked for. And so in that sense, it is certainly something that's unique to people who have a loved one who has, for example, some form of dementia or some form of terminal illness, such as a cancer, where you know that medicine, there's a limit to what medicine can do, and it's just a matter of time. But I mean, all those many other emotions that come in with a caregiving role, such as the sense of guilt, the frustration, the sense of loneliness and isolation, you'll see that no matter whether it's anticipatory grief or whether it's a fairly sudden grief. But I will say that anticipatory grief, because of the length of time, that makes it more challenging. So clearly a caregiver who's been, let's say, a caregiver for maybe half a year will have impacted differently emotionally and physically than someone who may have been a caregiver for 5 to 7 years.
That length of time. And that is another
Mm,
piece of it that's so hard is we don't know how long that time will last.
right.
Right?
Yep. Right.
It's the
And,
unknown.
and just sorry, if you don't mind, one
Hmm.
thing I just want to say, which is one of the things that some caregivers take on is that idea of now I have an opportunity to either really learn about my loved one that much more. So let's say the adult child gets an opportunity to learn about their parents' childhood. Or it can be a very different time frame with or opportunity, which is if there have been misunderstanding in that dynamic, it can also be an opportunity for clarifying misunderstandings. So that length of time can be used almost constructively
Right.
for some people, not for
Hmm.
all.
Hmm.
But I just felt that that was something that might be of relevance when you mentioned that length of time
Yeah.
when it comes to caregiving.
Right. Well, and it kind of speaks to my next question, which is, and you touched on it with the previous gentleman who had some healthy coping mechanisms, but that could be
Mm,
one strategy is to look at that time as constructive. Are there
hmm.
other strategies that you found that people can implement that can have that time be more meaningful?
So I have come across people who have developed programs where they will do a very short recording. So, for example, a woman has created this, and I'm forgetting the name of this app, but it's an app where you literally do a recording, which is only about 2 minutes. You may ask a question, and then you do the recording for 2 minutes, and it's specifically built for people with dementia.
Mm-hmm.
Their level of concentration or their ability to stay focused may be very limited. And that has been really rewarding for this woman who created this app. She used it with her mom. And so that's certainly something that has been very fruitful for
Mm-hmm.
her as she has been caring for her mom, as she has been experiencing increased memory problems. In terms of using the time constructively, I also would say that for some people, I've heard some wonderful stories where people, instead of being too sort of like trying to look at the big picture, they instead decide to take those minute by minute experiences. So, for example, another person in my caregiver support groups, she talked about her mom she has now passed away, but her mom, she had heart failure.
Mm.
And as her mom was becoming increasingly sick, every once in a while, they would suddenly spontaneously start a dance.
Mm.
They would just dance. And these are little moments that the adult daughter has told me that she cherishes and has a memory of.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it can be really helpful to just pick those little moments and really appreciate them for what they are, rather than try and be too sort of big picture.
Right.
I hope that makes sense. But
It
I
does,
found
yeah.
that can be really helpful for some people.
Hmm. There's the piece of community, which is so vital, right? We know that it's lonely, it can be isolating to be in that role. How can communities work together to combat some of those issues? And along with that, kind of the second side of that question is where can we tap into those community based initiatives and programs that can really impact our lives?
But as I mentioned, that isolation, sense of loneliness is huge amongst caregivers, especially for those who are taking on the brunt of the caregiving and have very few others to rely on, which
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately is often the case in many families. But my goal is to really make sure that people are aware of caregiver support groups. They are aware of, for example, there is the dementia cafes, that they are aware of many different resources in the community. Also, another thing that I think is very important, which what I found is many caregivers aren't aware of, is there's opportunities for respite. So, for example, an older care recipient can be placed in either a nursing home or memory care facility on a temporary basis, let's say a month.
Mm-hmm.
And this can give that caregiver that physical and mental break that they often need, where they can sort of recharge their batteries, and opportunity for reaching out to the lost connections that they may be experiencing because of the intense caregiving that they're giving. But it is critical, as with anyone who's feeling isolated or lonely, to really try and make it a routine to bring in, if possible, the next door neighbor for a cup of coffee. If possible, go out to the neighborhood restaurant with your loved one for a quick cup of coffee, but just get yourself out of the house if possible. If not, then try and bring other people into the home.
Oh, so important. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Because if you're doing this day by day by day, all on your own, and you're not getting outside or you're not seeing anyone but the care recipient, as you can well imagine, that is very challenging.
You had talked about the research you've done with older adults, so we could speak to
Mhm.
that as well. How do we find interaction and community for older adults as well?
So the research that I did was actually I'm a commissioner, a board member on the Newton Council on Aging. And we started doing some assessment of the general community's awareness of just the whole concept of loneliness and isolation. And we started this just before COVID. And it's been really interesting that over time, people's willingness and sense of understanding and appreciation for loneliness and isolation has grown exponentially, as you can imagine.
Right, been highlighted.
And so it's been, that's almost one of the upsides of COVID, is that people are much more willing to not only be aware that there are people who may be isolated, but they are also willing to talk about it, about themselves. With older adults, because often they may be living on their own, that sense of isolation and loneliness is even more an area of concern. And there, I think it's so important that neighbors try and do as much as possible, whatever they can do in terms of just knocking on the door, just checking, bringing the newspaper that may be at the end of the road, bringing it up to the doorstep. But neighbors are really, I think, something that we underutilize, which I think is a big shame, because I think people often want to help if they can. And what I've done with adult children who live out of state, I'll suggest to them, does your mom or your dad who is living on the, whatever neighborhood, do they know any of the next door neighbors? And, often they'll say yes. And then I'll say, well, look, do you think you could maybe connect with that next door neighbor and just say, look, would you mind just every once in a while just checking in on my parents? And as I said, many people are very open to that and appreciate being asked. Also, for people who are feeling lonely and isolated, the senior centers and the councils on aging have absolutely amazing programming. And I can't state that enough. And I think one of the things that, unfortunately, some people have some negative bias against senior centers and councils on aging, because they feel like, oh, that's where the old people go. That's where the poor people go. And I've been to many senior centers, and I cannot say that is so far from the truth. These are often very vibrant places, lots of creativity, lots of programming, and it is amazingly beneficial, not only for your physical health, because you can do all these exercise programs and you can do arts and you name it, crafts and everything, but also that socialization. And another thing that I also really try and get people to think about is try to become a volunteer. in whatever shape or form that you feel you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, see, having a sense of purpose and having a sense of responsibility can also be enormously beneficial for people who are feeling a little bit lonely.
Those are
So
great
that, yeah.
recommendations.
And also, if you can, and again, talking about the older person,
Mm-hmm.
if you can, try to be as honest about it as possible with maybe your family and just say, hey, I'd like some more phone calls, please.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people need to be a little bit knocked over the head.
It's so true, right? We
And
have
then
to
just,
speak up, yeah.
and just say, look, I'm here all by myself. You could also get the grandchildren to please call me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
an often quoted statement.
We always like to get those phone calls, don't we? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Hearing from others. With aging in place as being the preferred choice for many older adults. And I know this is really in your wheelhouse and expertise, is how do we as caregivers play that support role in enabling our older adults to age in place successfully?
So you're very right. The research seems to suggest that about 8 to 9 out of 10 older adults
Mm.
will say, I want to age in my own home for absolutely as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes complete sense. You know your neighborhood, you love your house, you may have lived there for 30 to 40 years. And so one of the things that can be done to help an older person be able to stay in their own home for as long as possible is doing home modifications, home renovations. So there is a lot that can be done to make the home safer and more comfortable to age in. So, for example, in terms of making it safer, get rid of any loose rugs because they can present as a horrible tripping hazard. Make sure that any loose wires aren't exposed. If, let's say, in the kitchen, whatever let's say your parent is often reaching up to get, if you can bring it down a little lower so it's easier for them to reach, because if things fall out and hit them on the head, that can certainly be a remedy for an accident.
Mm-hmm.
But also modifications in the bathroom can be done. And what I find is when I start bringing up any suggestion of modifications, a lot of people's reaction, oh, how expensive is that going to be? There's a lot that can be done that's pretty inexpensive. I will say this, and I had a learning moment. This is many months ago. I was talking to the owner of a home modification company, and he explained to me that unfortunately a lot of people assume that their Medicare will cover the costs.
Mm.
That's not the case.
Interesting.
But as he suggested, is that we in the elder care professional space, we need to do as much to advocate to get policies changed that will make sure that home modifications can be included. Because if you think about it, the more that can be done to make a home safe, the longer that person will be able to stay and age in place where they want to be. And the longer it will be before they need to go into some sort of facility, which is far more expensive. And for some people, certainly not the place they want to be.
Right. Yeah, putting those
So
things
that's
in place.
one of the key components about making sure that people can age in place. The other key component I would say is, and often what I'll do with my when I have clients, when I'm helping families, and this may seem like a small thing, but I think is really key, is to try and make sure that your loved one gets to be able to do the things that they love to do.
Yeah.
So you really should try and support them as much as possible in maintaining whatever routine that they have enjoyed. Does that mean that they would have a weekly get together with their friends at some cafe? Would they go for walks with a certain friend? I mean, whatever activities that gave them sense of happiness and meaning. The other critical component about this is transportation. As people age, they may become less and less comfortable with driving. And unfortunately, what happens is when people no longer feel comfortable driving or cannot drive, then the access to the outside world really shuts down. And therefore they become isolated and lonely. So again, let's say as the adult child trying to support your loved one to age in place, you want to make sure that do they have access to transportation? And again, senior centers, councils on aging can be incredibly resourceful with getting inexpensive transportation options. Not always the best, I must admit, because they're not always there on time or dropped you off at the time when you were hoping to be dropped off, but it's at least a potential resource to know about. You as the adult child or family member can also maybe be a little creative by trying to involve, as I mentioned earlier, neighbors, if they're willing. But transportation is another key area that you should think about in order to support that person in their own home.
When we limit our ability to the outside world, it gives us even more of that feeling that we're isolated. So transportation
Absolutely.
is
Yep.
such a big
Absolutely.
piece of that. Yeah, such
Yeah.
a big piece of that.
And another thing that I found is that trying to stay as physically active as possible is really important. Way back when I was doing my master's in social work, I was doing an internship at the Department of Public Health here in Boston. And I remember I had to do a report on mobility issues. And back then, I didn't fully understand why mobility was such an issue for older adults. And obviously, with a little bit of experience and life experience as well, I've come to understand that with the aging process, if you don't stay active, then again, your ability to get out, be part of society becomes vastly reduced. And you're more likely for falls and things like that. So trying to be as physically active as possible is another key area to be in order to ensure that you can age in place.
I was talking with a neuropsychologist the other day, and a piece of that is also preventing dementia as we're using our body and just being active. And he kept just bringing that up, and I think we don't overlook it. We know it's important, but I
Yep.
don't think we realize how many aspects of our life that it impacts: our brain health, our
Yep.
ability to stay
Absolutely.
active and be mobile in our communities, to get out and to do all the things that we love to do. So it's just another great reminder of just the importance of that.
Totally.
For younger generations, for caregivers, and we're actually finding in the data that caregiving is really increasing between the ages of, I think it's like 18 and 47. There's such a
Right.
large group of younger people.
Mm,
For your perspective and how you support families planning ahead, what
hmm
do you recommend? Where's a good place to start? I think at times we're like, oh my gosh, there's so much to think about. What are some ways that we can easily kind of dive in and get our bearings in the beginning?
So the way I recommend is for people who, so senior centers, councils on aging, they have lots of different programs that can provide information on Meals on Wheels, provide information on transportation options. They can provide information on volunteering opportunities, doing the taxes. So the senior center is definitely an excellent place to start. But I also would recommend that people reach out to other caregivers and get some information from them, like how did you start? What were maybe some of the barriers that you came across? What can I do to prevent this? How do I start the conversation? And that I think is probably, I think it's sort of a two-pronged approach. You go off, try and find some information, but you also start that conversation with your loved one.
Right.
And what I mean by that is just trying to get an understanding of is what are their thoughts about their own old age? What are their wishes? What are their needs? Now, of course, you always have to balance everything with what their wishes are versus what is reasonable and
Right,
doable,
realistic,
right?
yeah.
And what's safe.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's tricky. That certainly is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot on the internet. However, I will say that often I come across people who'll say they were just inundated with information. And it was almost less helpful
Right.
because it was just
Where
they
do I
were going on
go?
one web page and then they went over to another and then they went over to another.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I have found a great starting point is an elder care consultant. And that is someone that can really sort of take your situation into, put that into focus
Yeah.
and really help you on your sort of specific personal situation dynamics. One of the things what I found is not only is it the practical stuff that you're
Mm-hmm.
helping your family with, but it often is also a lot of the emotional stuff,
Right.
family dynamics, misunderstandings, making sure you get the family on the same page. But obviously, an elder care consultant costs money.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're trying to do it as cheaply as possible, then I would recommend going to a senior center, council on aging. At least just get as much bits of information as you can. And the people who work in these centers are absolutely wonderful people. And they have been through whatever scenario that you might describe. They'll at least be able to direct you in whatever situation that you might have.
They have the knowledge, and think of all the people they've worked with, right? So they have the opportunity to direct you in places where you
Right.
might need those
Yep.
services. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'll say is a key area that talking about, being at that point in your life where you know you need to start assessing what's going on and learning. One of the things I found is that the workplace is where there's a huge population of these, what we call the sandwich generation.
Mm-hmm.
They may have sort of teenage kids that they're caring for, and they also have that aging parent. And imagine someone who's grappling with these two different groups of people, as well as working full time.
Mm-hmm.
They're often inundated and feel very stretched thin. So one of the things I'm really trying to get the workplace is to realize that as much as possible, what they can do to help these employees become much more proactive in their planning,
Right.
so that they have a sense of what's out there in terms of services, resources, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So that when that medical crisis does happen, they at least have some sense of next steps.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the workplace is now starting to wake up to the need for elder care knowledge of their employees. So when you think about it, back in, I think, 60s and the 70s, when a lot of these baby boomers were having children,
Right.
right? Then the whole conversation was about what do we do
Childcare.
with our
Yeah.
children?
Mm-hmm.
And the workplace had to create childcare.
Yeah.
Well, now the workplace is now at the other end of the spectrum with a lot of these baby boomers who are now aging. By 2026, the first of the baby boomers are going to be turning 80.
Mm.
So now the conversation has flipped over to, gee, what
Yeah.
do we do with that group of people? How can we support them?
The movement, when you've got that large population in numbers, the power behind that, and
Absolutely.
how it affects change. You're right. I do think there's absolutely more of a conversation in the workplace about how we support adults with aging parents and what that looks like. I'm seeing more and more programs and things. Are you finding companies are receptive to that and are making change?
Yes, I totally am. I've actually had several companies now reach out to me and say, tell me more about what you're doing and the why
Good.
should we, why should we pay attention to this?
Right.
And the key thing that I say is, you want to make sure that your employees are focused not anxious, not sort of distracted because they're worried about a loved one at home. And also you want to make sure that your employees continue working for as long as possible. So again, an employee who is more prepared, has some plan in place, will be able to continue working for as long as possible. And I mean, ultimately, the loss in salary and benefits to the employee who exits the workforce prematurely is astounding. The last stats that I saw, which are actually fairly old, they're about 10 or so years old. People on average were losing about $300,000 in lost salary and benefits because they quit prematurely.
Wow, it is staggering, and I'm sure it's even more now.
And it's most likely a lot more now. But again, I think one of the things that COVID showed us was the stresses of caregiving. And I think that also, not only are employers realizing that we are living in an aging population, but they're also more appreciative of the physical and the emotional stress of being a caregiver, whether you're caring for young children or whether you're caring for an older adult.
We realized that because we were all collectively placed in environments where we needed to do that. So I think people that previously hadn't experienced that had this awakening of, wow, this is actually a really big need.
And I think also employers got to see what the home life was like through Zoom calls. They would see the screaming kids in the background, or they would see, maybe an older parent with dementia calling out. So yes, it's in that sense, I think that sort of work-life balance has become a greater part of the American conversation. It certainly existed I'm actually Scandinavian. I'm from Denmark.
Right.
And that work-life balance and understanding the pressures of the home life and the responsibilities of home life has been part of that conversation for years. And so I'm glad to see that America is starting to acknowledge what's really going on.
Yes. Doesn't Denmark rate really high in terms of, I remember seeing a report, I don't know, through Time or I don't know, some magazine where the quality of life that the population feels in those Scandinavian countries is very high.
Denmark was scoring, not the last year, but they have been scoring highest on the happiness.
That's it. Yes.
The happiness index. And I think it's got a lot to do with that the Danes have tremendous cradle to grave social support.
Right. Yeah.
So people are not worried about making sure that they have enough means to support themselves over the next month or year because they know that they will have a support system, whether it be in the community or whether it be the workplace.
Completely. Yeah. And it plays out in the happiness score. We can see that.
It does, exactly.
We can see that. Share with us how you support families. What are you up to? Where can we learn more? Where can people connect with you if they really, really want that one-on-one support?
Sure. So through my website, which is helpmyagingparents.net, you can go to my website and you can reach out to me in that way. The way that I help families is really try and help them walk through the steps from A to Z in terms of getting that conversation started, knowing what are the areas that family needs to focus on, what are the unique needs of that individual, what are the possibilities. So I sort of try and get the family to realize, okay, this is what maybe the older parent wants, but this is what's probably safer, doable. So, and I also try to make sure that, as I mentioned earlier, especially when you got multiple children, making sure that everyone's on the same page. And invariably, there may be some disagreements. And I often will say, that's not surprising because one child has a certain relationship with a parent and another child has a different relationship with the parent, and they may have gotten two different messages. So when they come to the table and they say, well, mom wants this, and the other child says, no, mom wants this, it's not surprising. So there's a careful balancing act where I try and make sure that for families to realize that the goal is the same. And it means, we all want the same thing. How can we get there? Then sometimes it requires exploring some different options. But very quickly people come to the table because they know, we want to make sure that mom is as comfortable as possible or dad is as safe as possible. Also, as I've said multiple times to you, that letting people know what are the resources and services available in their community, breaking the bad news to people, which is Medicare does not cover these kinds of services, long-term care services. Unfortunately, many families are under the expectation that, Medicare will cover all that. That's not the case. So again, it sort of begs that point about getting started as early as possible. So if you need to put a little bit of money aside, you can do that. If you need to start involving other people from different locations, you can start doing that. The other thing I just want to point out, I've had people who will say to me, when I just have a general discussion about what I do, they'll say, well, I don't really understand. How can someone go to you when they don't know what the future holds? They don't know what medical crisis their loved one's going to experience. The point, though, is that the same fundamental issues need to be sorted out. You do need to make sure you got all the legal documents sorted out. You do need to know who are their healthcare providers, what kind of medications are they taking thus far. You do need to know what are their wishes, their desires. You do need to have a sense of what their financial situation is like. What do they owe? What are their assets? And all of this sort of gives you sort of a framework for getting a sense of what can they afford in terms of services going into the future.
I love
and what
that
I
you shared that.
and sorry, one last thing I just want to say is what I find is instead of taking the conversation as being something dreadful, it can sometimes be something that's actually very heartwarming, because you get into sort of a much more in-depth conversation about what's important to that individual, what's meaningful to them.
Yes.
So sometimes I try and get people to sort of not focus too much on all the death and dying stuff, but focus more on what do you want to do over the next many years that's going to sort of make you feel that you've achieved whatever goals that you still have, because we always have wishes and things that we want to experience, no matter what our age is.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it really is our lens and how we approach all those conversations, right? If we're going into it with dread and fear, they will receive that from us. Rather than if we go through this with, how do you want these next years to be so fruitful for you and full of joy, and how can we support that?
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, speaking from my own experiences, sometimes what I found is families will go off and they'll attempt that conversation, and it doesn't go quite as smoothly as they had hoped. Because that the parent will say, I'm fine, don't worry about it, I'm doing just fine in the home. You don't need to worry about me. Sometimes I will say to families, look, then the next step is to say very bluntly, I'm worried, please help me. You'll do me such a service by letting me understand more what's going on, where you might need help. It'll help me. That can sometimes open sort of the crack.
It does.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And make that person open up a little bit and say, okay, well, I'm not doing it so much for myself. I'm doing it for my child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of little tricks that can be used to make this whole process easier.
Yes. Well, we'll just all have to come to you and learn all those tricks and have that support as we do that. So I
Absolutely.
thank you. And it's been wonderful to catch up and hear your perspective and all of your life experience that you've shared with us today. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It has been an absolute delight. And thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
This is so important to get this information out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.